The last thing I saw before I ran out of that forest was the white antelope standing exactly where I had killed it. It wasn't bleeding anymore, it wasn't even lying on the ground. It was standing between two giant iroko trees, staring at me. I know how that sounds. If someone else had told me this story years ago, I would have laughed and called them a liar. But after what happened to my village, I don't care who believes me anymore. I'm over 40 now and I still refuse to walk anywhere near that forest. People think the old stories about spirits and sacred places are just ways to scare children. I used to think the same thing. I was wrong. Everything started when I was 19 years old. I grew up in a small farming village in Western Africa. Life was simple. We woke before sunrise, worked on our farms until evening, and gathered around small fires at night while the elders told stories. Most of those stories were about one place, the forest. Not just any forest, the oldest forest our village had ever known. It was so large that nobody knew where it ended. Even the oldest hunters admitted they had never seen the other side. The trees were taller than anything I have seen since. Some of the Iroko trees were so wide that six grown men could not hold their hands around them. The ground was always covered with dry leaves. Even on hot afternoons, sunlight barely reached the forest floor. People simply called it the old forest. There was only one rule: never hunt the white antelope. The strange thing was that almost nobody had ever seen it. The elders said it only appeared when it wanted someone to follow it. Some claimed it had bright white fur that never became dirty. Others said its eyes looked almost human. A few people even believed it wasn't an animal at all. I never believed any of that. To me, it sounded like another village tale created to keep young hunters from wandering too far. I respected the forest, but I didn't fear it. That confidence came from my father. He was one of the best hunters our village had ever known. He wasn't famous because he killed the biggest animals. People respected him because he never hunted more than his family needed. He always said the forest gave life to the village. If you became greedy, the forest would stop feeding you. At the time, I thought he was only talking about protecting nature. Now I think he meant something else. By the time I turned 19, I had become a hunter too. Not a great one, not yet, but I was strong, fast, patient. The older hunters had started allowing me to join them on long hunting trips. I wanted people to stop calling me a boy. I wanted them to speak my name the way they spoke my father's. Looking back now, pride was the first mistake I made. The second mistake came during the dry season. That year, hunting became difficult. Animals seemed to disappear. The rivers became smaller. The ground cracked under the sun. Every hunting trip ended with little or nothing. Some families started eating only once each day. Nobody complained. That was simply how life was. But one evening, while we sat around the village fire, I noticed something strange. The older hunters looked worried, not tired, not hungry, worried. They kept looking toward the forest. None of them said anything. That silence bothered me more than any story. A few days later, my father returned from hunting before noon. That had never happened before. His bag was almost empty. He cleaned his spear without saying a word and went inside our house. My mother asked no questions. I did. He only shook his head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering what had frightened a man who had spent nearly 40 years inside that forest. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Instead of going to the farm, I quietly sharpened my spear. I packed dried cassava, a calabash of water, and a small hunting knife. I told nobody where I was going. If I had told my father, he would have stopped me. At least, I think he would have tried. The morning air was cool when I reached the edge of the forest. Birds were singing, monkeys jumped between branches. Everything looked normal. I remember smiling to myself. I actually felt excited. I believed I was about to prove that all those old stories were nothing but fear passed from one generation to another. The deeper I walked, the quieter the forest became. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. The birds disappeared first, then the insects. Even the sound of the wind seemed to fade. Soon, the only thing I could hear was my own footsteps crushing dry leaves. I stopped walking. The silence didn't feel natural. It felt like something was listening. I looked around. Nothing. Only trees. Thousands of them. I laughed quietly. I remember saying to myself that I was allowing old stories to enter my head. So I continued walking. About an hour later, I found fresh hoof prints in the soft ground. They were unlike any tracks I had seen before. They looked too clean, too perfect. I crouched beside them. They were fresh, very fresh. Whatever had made them couldn't be far away. Excitement pushed away my fear. I followed the tracks. They twisted between giant roots, crossed a narrow stream, past trees covered in thick green moss. The deeper I went, the cooler the air became. I had no idea how far I had walked. The forest no longer looked familiar. Then I noticed something else. The tracks had suddenly stopped, not faded, stopped, as if the animal had simply disappeared. I searched the ground again and again. Nothing. I stood there for several minutes trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I heard it. A single footstep behind me. I turned so quickly that I nearly dropped my spear. Nothing. Again. Only trees. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was probably a monkey or a bush pig. Anything except what the stories described. I took one slow step forward. Another footstep echoed behind me, exactly one. I turned again. Still nothing. The feeling that I was no longer alone settled deep inside me. For the first time that day, I thought about going home. I should have listened to that feeling. Instead, I tightened my grip on my spear and kept moving. A few minutes later, I walked into a small clearing. The sunlight reached the ground there. It was the brightest place I had seen since entering the forest. Everything became still. Even the leaves had stopped moving. Then I saw it, standing beneath an ancient Iroko tree, perfectly calm, perfectly white, the most beautiful antelope I had ever seen. Its fur looked almost silver under the sunlight. Not a single stain, not a single scar. It wasn't eating, it wasn't drinking. It was simply staring at me. The strange part wasn't its color. It was its eyes. They didn't look frightened. They didn't look wild. They looked like they already knew who I was. It stood there without moving, without running, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I slowly lifted my spear. The antelope still didn't move. That was the moment I should have turned around. That was the moment I should have remembered every warning the elders had ever given. Instead, I smiled because I thought I had just found the greatest hunting story our village would ever hear.